Faced with a cruel diagnosis, a millionaire father watches his only son slowly wither away with no hope. But everything changes when a street girl appears at the mansion and, with a timid smile, gives the boy back his will to live. And so, with the magic dust of friendship, the miracle was born that medicine could not explain. If you were touched by this beautiful story of resilience and love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing. William Montgomery stared out the window of his penthouse office, overlooking the sprawling skyline of Boston. As CEO of Montgomery Innovations, one of the largest tech companies in America, he had built an empire worth billions, yet at this moment, none of it mattered. The words from Dr. Patterson still echoed in his mind, delivered just hours earlier in a hushed consultation room at Massachusetts General Hospital. Advanced stage leukemia. Aggressive progression. 1 month, maybe 2 at most. Will closed his eyes, his hands gripping the windowsill until his knuckles turned white. His 7-year-old son, Ethan, was all he had left after Sarah's passing 3 years ago. The memory of his late wife's smile flashed across his mind, the same smile their son had inherited. The thought that he might lose Ethan too was unfathomable. "Mr. Montgomery?" His assistant, Jessica, spoke softly from the doorway. "Your car is ready. The medical equipment has been delivered to your home as requested." Will nodded without turning around. "Thank you. Cancel all my meetings for the next month. Transfer operational decisions to the board. I'll be working remotely until further notice." Jessica hesitated. "Sir, the Reynolds merger can wait," Will interrupted, finally facing her. "Nothing is more important than my son right now." The drive to his Beacon Hill mansion felt surreal. The autumn leaves in Boston Common were turning vibrant shades of amber and crimson, a stark contrast to the grey cloud hanging over Will's heart. People walked their dogs, jogged along pathways and went about their lives, oblivious to the fact that his world was collapsing. Inside the mansion, the transformation was already underway. The East Wing, where Ethan's bedroom was located, had been converted into a private medical facility. Hospital equipment, monitoring machines and medication stations had been installed under the supervision of nurse Melissa Collins, who would be living in-house. "We're all set up." "Mr. Montgomery," Melissa said, checking a final list on her tablet, "Dr. Patterson has arranged for 2 additional nurses to rotate shifts. The medication schedule is programmed, and we've installed the monitoring system throughout this wing." Will nodded mechanically. "Where is he?" "In his room. The doctor gave him something to help him rest after the tests today." Will climbed the grand staircase, each step heavier than the last. The hallway leading to Ethan's room seemed to stretch endlessly. He paused outside the door, gathering himself before entering. The spacious bedroom that once echoed with laughter and imagination now hummed with the quiet beeping of machines. Ethan lay in his bed, looking smaller than Will had ever seen him. His normally tousled brown hair was limp, his skin pale against the blue of his favorite rocket ship bedsheets. Will sat gently on the edge of the bed, taking his son's hand. Even in sleep, Ethan's face had lost the carefree expression of childhood, replaced by a subtle tension that no 7-year-old should carry. "I'm right here, buddy," Will whispered. "Dad's not going anywhere." The next few days established a grim routine. Mornings began with medication, followed by visits from specialists Will had flown in from around the country. Afternoons were for treatment sessions, and evenings were the worst, when Ethan was too exhausted to even play with his favorite toys, but too uncomfortable to sleep. Will had assembled a team of the world's leading oncologists, each offering second, third, and fourth opinions. He'd reached out to research facilities developing experimental treatments. He'd even consulted alternative medicine practitioners. Despite his lifelong skepticism, money was no object. He would have spent every penny of his fortune for just 1 more day with his son. But as each day passed, Ethan seemed to fade a little more. His appetite disappeared. The spark in his blue eyes, so like his mother's, dimmed. He stopped asking to go outside, stopped talking about school, stopped imagining adventures with his toy dinosaurs. The vibrant, curious boy who once raced through the halls pretending to be an astronaut now spent hours silently staring out his window. On a particularly difficult evening, Will sat beside Ethan's bed, reading from their favorite adventure book. though he wasn't sure if his son was listening. "Dad?" Ethan's voice was barely audible. Will immediately set the book down. "Yes, buddy? Am I going to see Mom soon?" The question pierced Will's heart like a blade. He struggled to maintain his composure, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. "No, Ethan," he said firmly, squeezing his son's hand. "You're going to stay right here with me for a very long time." But the words felt hollow even to his own ears. The treatments weren't working. Ethan was slipping away, and all of Will's power, all his wealth, all his determination couldn't stop it. Later that night, after Ethan had finally fallen asleep, Will retreated to his study. The room was lined with awards, business magazines featuring his face on the cover, and photographs documenting his rise to success. None of it meant anything now. He pulled out a bottle of scotch from the cabinet, something he rarely did since becoming a single father. As he poured a glass, his phone buzzed. It was Dr. Patterson. "The latest results aren't showing improvement," the doctor said quietly. "The cell count is still increasing despite the aggressive treatment. I think we need to discuss comfort measures, Mr. Montgomery." "No," Will's voice was steel. "We're not giving up. There must be something else we can try. We've exhausted all conventional options, and the experimental treatments aren't showing efficacy. At this point, we need to consider Ethan's quality of life in the time he has left." Will ended the call without responding. Comfort measures. It was medical speak for surrender, for accepting the inevitable. But Will Montgomery hadn't built an empire by accepting limitations. He couldn't accept this one. Not when it came to his son. He spent the rest of the night researching, calling contacts in medical research, offering funding, promising resources, anything to find a solution. By morning, he had new specialists flying in, new treatment protocols to try. He would fight until the very end. But a week later, even Will had to face the truth. Ethan was deteriorating rapidly. He rarely woke now, and when he did, he seemed confused and distant. The mansion was silent, except for the constant hum of machines and the hushed voices of medical staff. Will sat by his son's bedside, holding his hand, feeling utterly helpless for perhaps the first time in his adult life. He was a man who controlled markets, who employed thousands, who made decisions affecting millions of dollars daily. Yet he couldn't control the most important thing in his world, his son's health. "Mr. Montgomery?" Nurse Melissa appeared at the door. "There's a situation at the gate you should be aware of." Will frowned. "I'm not to be disturbed. Whatever it is, have security handle it." "It's a child, sir." "A little girl." She somehow got past the outer perimeter. "Security is preparing to remove her, but she's causing quite a scene, saying she needs to see the boy in the castle. I thought you should know before they call the authorities." Will sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Fine, tell them I'll be right down." He leaned over, kissing Ethan's forehead. "I'll be right back, buddy," he whispered, though he wasn't sure his son could hear him. Little did he know that this interruption would change everything, that the unexpected visitor at his gate would bring what all his money and power couldn't buy. Hope. Will hurried down the grand staircase, irritation mixing with exhaustion. The last thing he needed was a security incident. As he approached the main entrance, he could hear the commotion outside. A child's voice, high and insistent, arguing with his security team. "Sir, we tried to escort her off the property, but she keeps coming back," explained Robert, his head of security, as Will stepped onto the portico. She slipped through the hedge line on the east side. "We're checking for vulnerabilities now." Will's attention focused on the small figure standing defiantly before two imposing security guards. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, the same age as Ethan. Her clothes were worn and mismatched, faded jeans with a hole in one knee, a too large sweater with frayed cuffs, and sneakers so dirty their original color was indiscernible. Her dark hair was tangled, and smudges of dirt marked her face. But her eyes, a startling green, blazed with determination. "I need to see him," she was insisting, clutching a crumpled, faded brochure in her small hands. "The boy who lives in the castle." Will approached slowly. "I'm William Montgomery. This is my home. Who are you and what are you doing here?" The girl turned those fierce green eyes on him, unintimidated by his stern tone. "My name's Abigail." "Abigail Foster, but everyone calls me Abby." She held up the brochure, which Will now recognized as an old pamphlet from a charity gala his company had hosted years ago. The Montgomery mansion had been featured prominently, lit up like a fairy tale castle. "I saw your castle from the park. I thought maybe a prince lived here." Despite everything, Will almost smiled at the childlike logic. "This isn't a castle, it's just a house. A big one, but still just a house." Abby looked unconvinced. "Does a boy live here?" "I thought I saw someone watching from the window upstairs." Something cold settled in Will's stomach. Ethan's room overlooked the front gardens, but he'd been bedridden for weeks, barely able to sit up without assistance. It wasn't possible that this girl had seen him at the window. "My son is very ill," Will said firmly. "He's not receiving visitors. I'm sorry, but you need to leave now. Where are your parents? Do they know you're here?" A shadow passed over the girl's face. "My mom and dad got swept away in the flood last year. I stay at Pine Hills Children's Home now, but sometimes I go exploring." Will's expression softened slightly. "You ran away from your group home?" Abby shrugged. "Just for the day. I'll go back before dinner. They won't even notice I'm gone." The casual way she said it, as if her absence wouldn't concern anyone, struck Will hard. "Robert, call Pine Hills and let them know we've found one of their children," Will instructed, then turned back to the girl. "You shouldn't be wandering around alone. It's not safe." "I'm not afraid," Abby stated matter-of-factly, "and I'm good at taking care of myself." She peered around Will toward the house. "Is your son very sick? Is that why there are doctors' cars parked here?" Will hesitated, unsure why he was even engaging with this strange, precocious child. Perhaps it was the exhaustion breaking down his usual barriers, or perhaps it was simply the distraction from the weight of grief pressing down on him. "Yes, he's very sick. That's why we need quiet, and why you can't be here disturbing everyone." Abby considered this, then nodded solemnly. "I understand. I was sick once too after the flood. I had pneumonia." She pronounced the word carefully, clearly proud of knowing such a sophisticated term. "The doctors said I might not make it, but I did. I'm tougher than I look." Before Will could respond, a weak voice called from the doorway behind him. "Dad? Who's that?" Will turned, shocked to see Ethan standing in the entrance hall, supported by Nurse Melissa. His son looked fragile in his pajamas, his face gaunt and his body trembling slightly with the effort of standing, but his eyes were more alert than they had been in days. "Ethan, you shouldn't be out of bed." Will rushed to his son's side, concern flooding through him. "I heard voices," Ethan explained, his gaze fixed on Abby. "Who is she?" Will was about to usher his son back inside when Abby stepped forward, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "I'm Abby," she announced, approaching Ethan with a casual confidence. "Your house looks like a castle from outside. Do you have secret passages and hidden treasures?" Ethan blinked, momentarily taken aback by her directness. Then, to Will's astonishment, a faint smile appeared on his son's face, the first real smile in weeks. "No secret passages," Ethan replied, his voice weak but interested. "But my dad says there used to be a wine cellar that got sealed up 100 years ago. No one knows what might be down there now." Abby's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? That's just like in the book I found at the library, The Secret of Thornfield Manor." There was a hidden room where they kept all sorts of treasures. "I have that book," Ethan said, his interest visibly growing. "Dad, can she come in? Just for a little while, please?" Will froze, torn between his protective instincts and the miracle of seeing his son engaged with the world again. Nurse Melissa gave him a significant look over Ethan's head, a silent communication that said this brief interaction had already brought more life to his son than any treatment had in weeks. "Just for a short visit," Will conceded reluctantly. "Melissa, please call Dr. Patterson and let him know Ethan is up." As they made their way into the house, Will held Ethan's other arm, acutely aware of how frail his son had become. Abby walked alongside them, chattering without any sense of the gravity of the situation. "Your castle is even better inside. Do you have a throne room or a dragon?" "In my stories, castles always have at least one dragon, usually in the dungeon." Ethan's small shoulders shook with what Will realized was a silent laugh. "No dragons, but we do have a really big fish tank in the library. Some of the fish look kind of like dragons. Can I see them?" Abby asked eagerly. Will expected Ethan to tire quickly, but instead his son directed them to the library, pointing out features of the house along the way, as if giving a tour to an important visitor. By the time they reached the library with its floor-to-ceiling aquarium, Ethan was visibly exhausted, but more animated than he had been in a long time. Abby pressed her face against the glass, watching in wonder as exotic fish in brilliant colors swam by. "They're beautiful," she breathed. "Like underwater rainbows." Ethan settled into his favorite reading chair, watching Abby's reactions with evident pleasure. "That blue and yellow one is a queen angelfish, and the spotted one is a leopard grouper." "You know all their names?" Abby asked, impressed. "I used to want to be a marine biologist," Ethan replied, a shadow crossing his face, "before I got sick." An uncomfortable silence fell, broken only by the gentle bubbling of the aquarium filters. Will tensed, waiting for the inevitable awkward questions about Ethan's illness. Instead, Abby turned from the tank and fixed Ethan with those intense green eyes. "You still can be. You don't look that sick to me." Will winced at the blunt statement, ready to intervene, but Ethan didn't seem offended. "The doctors say I am," he replied simply. Abby shrugged. "Doctors don't know everything. My friend at Pine Hills, Mrs. Eleanor, she's 92. The doctors told her she had 6 months to live when she was 50. She says they've been wrong for over 40 years, and she plans to make it an even 50 just to prove them extra wrong." Ethan's eyes widened, and for a moment something like hope flickered across his face. "Really? Really," Abby confirmed with absolute conviction. "I think you're going to be okay. You don't have that look." "What look?" Ethan asked. "The giving up look. Some kids at the hospital had it. But you don't." Will felt a complex mix of emotions watching this exchange. Part of him wanted to shield Ethan from this strange conversation that touched too closely on painful truths. Another part was mesmerized by the spark of life that had returned to his son's eyes. Melissa appeared at the door. "Mr. Montgomery, Dr. Patterson is on his way, and Pine Hills Children's Home returned our call. They're sending someone to pick up Abigail." Ethan's face fell. "Does she have to go already?" Abby didn't seem particularly concerned about being caught out of bounds. "I can come back tomorrow," she said confidently, as if her return was a foregone conclusion rather than a request. "I can bring my collection of rocks that look like faces. I have 17 of them. You can't just—" Will began, then faltered as he saw the look of eager anticipation on Ethan's face. It had been so long since his son had shown interest in anything, let alone expressed a desire for tomorrow. "Please, Dad," Ethan pleaded. "Abby can be my first friend since I got sick." Will ran a hand through his hair, knowing he was probably making a mistake, but unable to deny his son this small happiness. "We'll need to speak with the people at Pine Hills properly. There are procedures for this sort of thing." "So she can come back?" Ethan pressed. Will nodded slowly. "If Pine Hills agrees and if Dr. Patterson thinks it's okay for you to have visitors." Ethan's face lit up, and he turned to Abby. "You'll really come back tomorrow?" Abby nodded solemnly. "I promise, and I never break promises. That's my most important rule." As if to seal this vow, she reached into the pocket of her tattered jeans and pulled out a small, smooth stone. She placed it in Ethan's hand. "This is my lucky rock. It's shaped like a heart, see? You can borrow it until tomorrow." Ethan examined the stone, which did indeed have a rough heart shape. "Thank you," he said, clutching it tightly. Will watched this exchange with a mixture of confusion and wonder. There was something extraordinary about this scruffy, confident child who had wandered into their lives, and in the space of half an hour, accomplished what teams of specialists hadn't been able to do. She had brought his son back to life, if only momentarily. As Melissa guided Ethan back to his room to rest before the doctor's arrival, Will found himself alone with Abby. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being kind to my son." Abby looked at him with those old soul eyes. "He's nice, and he lives in a castle. Why wouldn't I be kind to him?" Such simple logic, yet profound in its own way. Will felt a strange tightness in his chest. "Abby, when you said Ethan doesn't have the giving up look, what did you mean?" Abby considered the question seriously. "Some people decide they're going to leave before they actually do. You can see it in their eyes. They're already saying goodbye, but Ethan's not saying goodbye. He's just waiting for someone to remind him how to say hello again." With those words, something shifted in Will's universe, a tiny crack in the wall of despair that had been closing in around him. He didn't understand why this child's perspective affected him so deeply, but for the first time since Ethan's diagnosis, He felt a flicker of what might have been hope. And as he watched Abby being escorted to the car that would take her back to Pine Hills, he found himself hoping fervently that she would indeed return tomorrow, bringing with her that inexplicable magic that had momentarily transformed his dying son back into a curious, engaged child. Little did he know that this was just the beginning, that Abby's promise to return would set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about life, love and healing. Dr. Patterson was examining Ethan when Will returned to his son's room. The physician's eyebrows rose in surprise as he checked Ethan's vitals. His heart rate is stronger today, and his blood pressure has stabilized somewhat, Dr. Patterson remarked, studying the monitors with cautious interest. Did you change anything in his regimen? Will hesitated, unsure how to explain what had just transpired. He had a visitor, a little girl about his age. It seemed to energize him somehow. The doctor looked skeptical. Social interaction can temporarily boost endorphins, but it doesn't change the underlying pathology. Still, I'm pleased to see any improvement, however slight. But Will could see there was more than a slight improvement. Ethan was sitting up against his pillows, the heart-shaped rock from Abby still clutched in his hand, a faint color in his cheeks that had been absent for weeks. "Dad, is Abby really coming back tomorrow?" Ethan asked as soon as the doctor had left. Will sat on the edge of the bed. "I'm working on it, buddy. There are some people I need to talk to first." "She has to come back," Ethan said with surprising firmness. "She promised." Will squeezed his son's hand. "I'll do my best. How about some dinner now? Melissa said you might like to try some chicken soup." To his amazement, Ethan nodded. "I am kind of hungry." It was the first time in nearly 2 weeks that Ethan had expressed any interest in food. Will's heart swelled with a dangerous emotion he dared not name. Not yet. He'd learned the hard way that hope could be the cruelest gift of all when it was snatched away. Later that evening, after Ethan had eaten half a bowl of soup and fallen asleep with Abby's stone still in his hand, Will made the call to Pine Hills Children's Home. After navigating several layers of bureaucracy, he finally reached the director, Miss Hartley. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice a mixture of respect and wariness, "I understand one of our residents paid an unauthorized visit to your home today. I want to assure you that such behavior is not condoned, and Abigail will face appropriate consequences." "Actually," Will interrupted, "I'm calling to request permission for Abigail to visit again. My son is gravely ill, and her presence today had a remarkably positive effect on his spirits. I'd like to arrange regular, supervised visits. If possible." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Montgomery," Ms. Hartley finally said, her tone cautious, "while I sympathize with your situation, I must consider Abigail's best interests. She has a history of forming intense attachments and then suffering greatly when circumstances change. Given your son's condition," she trailed off delicately. Will understood her implication immediately. She was concerned about Abby becoming attached to a dying child. "I appreciate your concern," Will said, choosing his words carefully. "But this would be mutually beneficial. Abby clearly enjoyed her visit, and my son, well, today was the first time he smiled in weeks. I'm prepared to make a substantial donation to Pine Hills to fund any additional supervision or transportation needs." The mention of a donation changed the director's tone subtly. "Well, in that case, perhaps we could work something out. Abigail does benefit from socialization opportunities. Her background has made forming appropriate peer relationships challenging." By the end of the call, Will had secured permission for Abby to visit the following afternoon. He'd also committed to a donation that would fund a complete renovation of Pine Hill's outdated playground. A small price to pay for the chance to see Ethan engaged with life again, even briefly. The next morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual and asked to get dressed properly for the first time since his hospitalization began. Melissa helped him into comfortable clothes instead of pajamas, and he even allowed her to help him to the bathroom to brush his teeth and comb his hair. "When is Abby coming?" he asked Will for the 3rd time that morning, sitting in a wheelchair by the window overlooking the garden. "After lunch," Will reminded him patiently, amazed at his son's transformation. "Remember, you need to rest before she gets here. You don't want to be too tired to show her your books." Ethan nodded seriously. "I'm saving my energy. That's what Nurse Melissa says I should do." Will felt a tightness in his throat. How long had it been since Ethan had something to look forward to? Something worth saving his precious energy for? True to her word, Abby arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, escorted by a caregiver from Pine Hills. She bounded out of the car with the same exuberant energy as the day before, carrying a small worn backpack. "Hi, Mr. Montgomery," she called, waving as if they were old friends. "I brought my rock collection like I promised Ethan." Will couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. "He's waiting for you in the sunroom. He's very excited to see you." Abby turned to her caregiver, a tired-looking woman in her 50s. "This is Ms. Winters. She has to stay with me because those are the rules. Is that okay?" "Of course," Will assured her. "Miss Winters is very welcome too." As Will led them through the mansion, Abby kept up a steady stream of observations and questions, seemingly unfazed by the opulence surrounding her. "Your house has so many rooms. Do you ever get lost? I counted 14 doors since we came in. Does each room have a different purpose? In my book, there was a castle with a room just for trying on hats. Do you have a hat room?" Her genuine curiosity was refreshing after weeks of somber medical discussions and hushed conversations. By the time they reached the sunroom where Ethan waited, Will found himself chuckling at her description of a squirrel she had named Sir Nutsworth, who regularly visited the Pine Hills playground. The moment Abby entered the sunroom, Ethan's face lit up. He was seated in his wheelchair near the windows, a blanket across his lap despite the warmth of the room. "Abby, you came back!" The joy in his voice was palpable. "I promised, didn't I?" she replied matter-of-factly, dropping her backpack on the floor and kneeling to unzip it. "I brought my rocks that look like faces. And I brought something else too, a surprise." Will and Ms. Winters exchanged glances as they settled into chairs at the edge of the room, giving the children space while maintaining supervision. "She's been talking about this visit all morning," Ms. Winters confided quietly. "Gathered her treasures, as she calls them, and insisted on wearing her lucky shirt. Though between you and me, I think every piece of clothing that child owns is considered lucky in some way." Will smiled. Ethan woke up asking about her. It's been a difficult time for him. This is the most engaged he's been in weeks. Ms. Winters nodded sympathetically. "Abby has that effect on people. There's something special about that girl. Despite everything she's been through, she has this remarkable capacity for joy." Their attention was drawn back to the children as Abby carefully arranged a collection of oddly shaped stones on the table between them. "This one looks like a grumpy old man," she was explaining, holding up a grey stone with natural indentations that did indeed resemble a frowning face. "And this one is a surprised lady. See her mouth? It's like she just heard some really shocking gossip." Ethan laughed, a sound so precious that Will had to look away for a moment to compose himself. "Now for the surprise," Abby announced, reaching deep into her backpack. She pulled out a tattered paperback book with a colourful cover. "It's The Secret of Thornfield Manor, the one we talked about yesterday. I checked it out from the library special for you." Ethan accepted the book reverently. "Thank you. It's one of my favorites." "Mine too," Abby exclaimed. "We can read it together if you want. I can do all the voices." For the next hour, the two children took turns reading aloud from the adventure novel, with Abby performing dramatic interpretations of the different characters that had Ethan giggling despite his weakness. Will watched in amazement as his son, who had been too exhausted to even hold a book for weeks, now leaned forward in his wheelchair, completely absorbed in the story. When Ethan began to tire, Abby seemed to sense it instinctively. Without drawing attention to his fatigue, she smoothly transitioned from reading to telling him about a butterfly garden she had discovered near Pine Hills. "The blue ones are my favorites. They're called morpho butterflies. Their wings look like they're made of blue metal that catches the light. I'm going to take you there someday," she stated with absolute certainty. "When you're feeling better." Will tensed, waiting for Ethan to react negatively to this unrealistic promise. To his surprise, Ethan simply nodded as if this future outing was a foregone conclusion. "I'd like that," he said softly. Then, after a brief hesitation, "Abby, the doctors say I'm not going to get better." The room went still. Ms. Winters shot Will a concerned glance, but he remained frozen, heart pounding as he waited for Abby's response. The little girl considered this statement with a seriousness that seemed beyond her years. Then she shook her head decisively. "They're wrong," she said with absolute conviction. "You're not going to leave." "I still have way too many things to do." "Like what?" Ethan asked, a desperate hope in his voice that tore at Will's heart. Abby didn't hesitate. "Like go to the butterfly garden with me, and find out what's in that sealed wine cellar your dad mentioned. And read the sequel to this book. Did you know there's a sequel where they find a whole underground city? And learn to play chess. I'm teaching myself from a book at the library, but I need someone to practice with." She ticked these items off on her fingers as if compiling a perfectly reasonable to-do list, rather than defying a terminal medical diagnosis. "You think I can do all that?" Ethan whispered. "I know you can," Abby replied. "I can feel it. Right here." She tapped her chest. "That's my other special talent besides finding face rocks. I can tell when people are going to stay or leave. And you're definitely staying." Will should have been horrified at this conversation. Every parenting instinct told him to intervene, to protect Ethan from false hope. Yet something stopped him. Perhaps it was the certainty in Abby's voice, or perhaps it was simply the way Ethan straightened in his wheelchair, a new determination in his posture. Miss Winters cleared her throat softly. "Abby, we should probably start thinking about heading back to Pine Hills soon. Remember you have your art therapy session at 4. Abby nodded reluctantly. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Before Miss Winters could respond, Will spoke up. "Actually, I've been discussing with Pine Hills about setting up regular visits. If Ethan is feeling up to it, and if you'd like to, you could come several times a week." Both children's faces lit up with identical expressions of delight. "Yes," Ethan exclaimed with more energy than Will had seen in months. "Every day would be better," Abby suggested hopefully. Ms. Winters chuckled. "Let's start with 3 days a week and see how it goes." As they prepared to leave, Abby approached Ethan's wheelchair and held out her hand. "You can keep the lucky rock. I have others. But I think you need this one right now." Ethan placed the heart-shaped stone in her palm. "I kept it under my pillow last night. I think it worked. I didn't have any bad dreams." Abby nodded solemnly, returning the stone to him. "That's what it does. Keeps the scary things away. Just keep it close." After they had gone, Ethan allowed Melissa to help him back to bed without complaint. He was clearly exhausted, but radiated a contentment that had been absent for so long. "Dad," he said as Will tucked him in, "Abby says I'm going to get better." Will felt his throat constrict. "Buddy, you know what Dr. Patterson said about your condition." "I know," Ethan interrupted. "But Abby says doctors don't know everything." "And I believe her." Will sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. "Ethan, I want nothing more than for you to get better. We're trying every treatment possible. But I don't want you to be disappointed if—" "She says I'm not going to leave," Ethan insisted, his eyes drifting closed as exhaustion overtook him. "And she never breaks promises. That's her most important rule." Long after Ethan had fallen asleep, Will remained by his bedside watching the gentle rise and fall of his son's chest. The rational, logical part of his mind, the part that had built a tech empire through calculated risk and strategic planning, knew that Abby's confident predictions were nothing more than a child's fantasy. Yet another part of him, a part he'd nearly forgotten existed, wanted desperately to believe, because today, for a few precious hours, his son had returned to him, not just physically but in spirit, laughing, engaging, planning for a future that all medical evidence said he wouldn't have. Was it cruel to allow this false hope? Or was hope itself, however irrational, a form of medicine that Ethan desperately needed? Will didn't have answers. But as he gently placed Abby's heart-shaped stone back in his sleeping son's hand, he made a decision. If Abby's presence brought Ethan happiness, in whatever time he had left, then Will would move heaven and earth to keep her coming back. What he didn't yet realize was that the magic of Abby's visits was only beginning, and that his own healing had already started, though he couldn't yet recognize the subtle changes taking root in his heart. Over the next few weeks, Abby's visits became the center around which Ethan's world revolved. She came reliably every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoon, each time bringing some new treasure or adventure to share. Some days she arrived with library books, other times with interesting leaves or feathers she'd collected. Once she brought a jar containing a caterpillar, excitedly explaining that they would watch its transformation together. By the time it becomes a butterfly, "You'll be feeling much better," she declared with her characteristic certainty. "Transformations take time. That's what Mrs. Eleanor at Pine Hills says." With each visit, Ethan seemed to grow stronger. The changes were subtle at first. He stayed awake longer, ate more consistently, and asked to move from his bed to the wheelchair more frequently. By the third week, he was asking to venture beyond his room and the sunroom, eager to show Abby different parts of the house. Dr. Patterson observed these changes with cautious interest. During his weekly comprehensive assessment, he noted the improvements in Ethan's vitals with a furrowed brow. "His red blood cell count has stabilized," he told Will privately after the examination. "It's still dangerously low, but the rapid decline we were seeing has..." paused for lack of a better word. "What does that mean?" Will asked, afraid to voice the hope building inside him. The doctor chose his words carefully. "It means he's fighting harder than expected. The disease is still present and aggressive, but Ethan's response to the treatment seems to have improved. I can't explain it medically. Sometimes we see these plateaus before a final decline, but..." Will prompted. "But this feels different," Dr. Patterson admitted. "His engagement level, his appetite, his overall demeanor. These are not typically what we see in terminal stages. I don't want to give false hope, Mr. Montgomery, but I am cautiously encouraged by what I'm seeing." Will nodded, afraid to fully embrace this tentative optimism, yet unable to dismiss it entirely. "It's the girl, Abby. Ever since she started visiting, he's been different. More present. More determined." Dr. Patterson smiled slightly. "I don't have a medical explanation for the impact of friendship on disease progression, but I've practiced long enough to know there are aspects of healing that science can't fully quantify. Whatever the reason, I support continuing anything that's contributing to this improvement." The doctor's cautious endorsement was all Will needed. He expanded Abby's visiting privileges, arranging for her to occasionally stay for dinner, and even coordinating with Pine Hills to allow Saturday visits when possible. He also increased his financial support to the children's home, funding not only the promised playground renovation, but also establishing a college scholarship program and donating new computers for their outdated learning center. Mies. Hartley, the director, was appropriately grateful but also increasingly curious about the relationship developing between the billionaire, his ill son, and their resident orphan. "Abigail talks about Ethan constantly," she told Will during one of his now regular calls to Pine Hills. "She's making get-well cards with our art therapist and collecting interesting stones for him during outdoor time. It's the most focused we've seen her since she came to us after the flood." "She's been a miracle for my son," Will replied simply, not knowing how else to express the transformation he was witnessing. On a crisp October day, about a month after Abby's first appearance at the mansion, Will was working remotely from his home office when Melissa knocked on his door. "Mr. Montgomery, Ethan is asking for you. He says it's important." Will immediately set aside his laptop. "Is something wrong?" Melissa smiled, something she'd been doing more frequently lately. "Not wrong, but he's quite insistent." Will found Ethan sitting up in bed, color in his cheeks, with a determined expression that reminded Will painfully of Sarah. "Dad, I want to go outside," Ethan announced without preamble. "To the garden. Abby's coming tomorrow and I want to show her the rose bushes before all the flowers are gone for winter." Will hesitated. "Buddy, it might be too cold." "Your immune system..." "Dr. Patterson said I'm getting stronger," Ethan interrupted. "And Nurse Melissa said fresh air might actually be good for me as long as I'm bundled up." "Please, Dad. I haven't been outside in forever." The plea in his son's eyes was impossible to resist. "All right, but only for a short time, and you'll need to wear warm clothes and stay in the wheelchair." Ethan's face lit up. "Thank you. Can we go now? I want to practice going out there so I can be a good tour guide for Abby tomorrow." 20 minutes later, Will pushed Ethan's wheelchair along the stone path that wound through the mansion's extensive gardens. The fall colors were at their peak, maples blazing red and orange, golden leaves drifting gently to the ground in the light breeze. Ethan wore a warm jacket, hat and a blanket across his lap, but his face was turned up to the sun, eyes closed in pure contentment. "It smells different than I remembered," he commented. "Better." Will realized with a pang that it had been over 3 months since Ethan had been outside, not since before his diagnosis. How many simple pleasures had been lost in the fog of illness and treatment? They stopped by Sarah's rose garden, which the gardeners maintained meticulously year-round in her memory. Late blooms still clung to some bushes, defying the approaching winter. "Mom would like Abby," Ethan said suddenly, reaching out to gently touch a pale pink rose. They both love flowers. Will swallowed hard. "Yes, I think she would have." "Abby doesn't have a mom or dad anymore," Ethan continued. "The flood took them away. That's why she lives at Pine Hills." "Yes, she told us that." Ethan looked up at his father, his expression serious. "Dad, what happens to kids at places like Pine Hills? Do they stay there forever?" Will sat on a nearby bench, moving into Ethan's line of sight. "No, not forever. Sometimes relatives adopt them. Sometimes other families who want children but don't have any of their own adopt them. But Abby's been there since last year. Why hasn't anyone adopted her yet?" It was a complex question with uncomfortable answers about the realities of the foster system, particularly for children past infancy. Will chose his words carefully. Finding the right family takes time. Abby is special. She deserves a family that will appreciate how unique and wonderful she is. Ethan nodded thoughtfully, then looked back at the roses. After a moment of silence, he spoke again. "Dad, when I get better, could we adopt Abby?" The question caught Will completely off guard. "Ethan, adoption is a very serious decision. It's not like taking in a stray pet." "I know that," Ethan interrupted, his voice surprisingly firm. "But Abby needs a family, and we need Abby. She makes everything better." "She makes me better." Will felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that his son, despite his illness, was perceiving truths that adults often overlooked. There was a wisdom in Ethan's simple logic that cut through all the complications adults would layer onto such a situation. "Let's focus on you getting stronger first," Will said gently. "But I promise I'll think about what you're asking." This answer seemed to satisfy Ethan for the moment, and they continued their tour of the garden. By the time they returned to the house, Ethan was tired but visibly happy. His cheeks flushed with fresh air and excitement about showing Abby his discoveries the next day. That night, Will found himself unable to sleep, Ethan's question echoing in his mind. The idea of adoption had never crossed his thoughts before. After Sarah's passing, he had focused entirely on Ethan and on running his company. The possibility of expanding their family had seemed not just unlikely but impossible. Yet now he couldn't stop thinking about it. About Abby with her determined spirit and old soul eyes, about the way she had marched into their lives and, through some inexplicable magic, begun to pull Ethan back from the edge of darkness, about the way she never asked for anything, never seemed impressed by the mansion's luxury, only by the connections she formed with the people inside it. The next day, Abby arrived as scheduled, bouncing with energy and carrying a small, soil-filled pot. "I brought a surprise," she announced as Will greeted her at the door. "Where's Ethan?" "Waiting for you in the garden," Will replied, enjoying her look of surprise. "The garden? He's outside?" Her face lit up with delight. "He wanted to show you something special. He was very excited about it yesterday." As Will led Abby through the house toward the garden doors, he found himself studying her more carefully than before. Her clothes were still mismatched and worn, but cleaner than when she had first appeared at their gate. Her dark hair had been neatly braided, though tendrils were already escaping around her face. She walked with a slight bounce in her step, the small plant pot clutched carefully in both hands. "What's in the pot?" Will asked, curious. Abby smiled mysteriously. "A magic bean. Well, not really magic like in the story, but special. Mrs. Eleanor gave it to me from her collection. She says it's a moonflower. It only blooms at night when the moon touches it. I thought Ethan could watch it grow and then see it bloom through his window." Once again, Will was struck by the thoughtfulness of this child who had so little yet gave so freely. "That's a wonderful gift, Abby. I'm sure Ethan will love it." They found Ethan waiting in his wheelchair by the rose garden, bundled up against the autumn chill but beaming with anticipation. The moment he saw Abby, he straightened and waved eagerly. "Abby, come see the roses. They were my mom's favorite." For the next hour, Will watched from a distance as Ethan gave Abby a tour of the garden, pointing out his favorite spots and telling her stories about planting certain flowers with his mother years before. Abby listened with rapt attention, asking questions and sharing her own observations. When Ethan presented her with a late-blooming rose, he had asked the gardener to cut for her. She cradled it as if it were made of precious crystal. In turn, she gave him the moonflower seedling, explaining its unique properties with such enthusiasm that anyone would have thought she was presenting him with a rare treasure. Ethan accepted the pot with equal reverence, immediately suggesting they place it on his windowsill, where it would get proper sunlight during the day and moonlight at night. Watching them together, heads bent over the small plant as they discussed its care, Will felt a certainty growing within him. There was something right about these two children together, something that transcended the circumstances that had brought them into each other's lives. Whether it was fate, coincidence, or some cosmic design, he couldn't deny that Abby had become essential to their world. When Ethan began to tire, they moved inside for hot chocolate and cookies in the kitchen, rather than returning him directly to his medical suite. It was another small step toward normalcy that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. As Abby chatted animatedly about a book she was reading at Pine Hills, Will noticed Melissa signaling to him from the doorway. He excused himself and joined her in the hall. "Dr. Patterson is here for Ethan's unscheduled blood work," Melissa informed him. "He says it can wait until after Abby's visit if you prefer." "No, let's get it done," Will decided. "Abby can stay longer today. I've already cleared it with Pine Hills." When Dr. Patterson arrived in the kitchen, Will was surprised to see Ethan introduce him to Abby without any of the usual anxiety that accompanied medical procedures. "This is my friend Abby," Ethan announced proudly. "She's teaching me about moonflowers and butterflies." Dr. Patterson smiled warmly. "It's nice to meet you, Abby. I've heard a lot about you from Ethan." Abby regarded the doctor with her characteristic directness. "Are you the one who told Ethan he was going to leave?" An uncomfortable silence fell. Dr. Patterson looked momentarily taken aback by the blunt question. "I'm Ethan's doctor," he replied carefully. "My job is to help him get better." Abby nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. "He is getting better. I told him he would." Dr. Patterson glanced at Will, then back at Abby. "Well, we're certainly seeing some positive changes." "That's because he has things to do," Abby stated matter-of-factly. "Like watch the moonflower bloom and visit the butterfly garden with me." After the blood draw was completed with minimal fuss from Ethan, Dr. Patterson asked to speak with Will privately. They stepped into the study, closing the door behind them. "I've been practicing medicine for 27 years, Dr. Patterson began, and I've learned to be very careful about using words like miraculous or inexplicable. But what we're seeing with Ethan defies conventional medical expectation." Will's heart began to race. "What are you saying?" "His latest results show actual improvement, not just stabilization. The cancer cells are still present, but their proliferation has slowed significantly. His body is responding to the treatments in a way we simply didn't anticipate given the advanced stage of his disease." Will sank into a chair, emotions washing over him in waves. "Do you mean he could—" "I'm not making any promises," Dr. Patterson cautioned. "This disease is aggressive and unpredictable. But yes, if this trend continues, we may be looking at the possibility of remission, something I wouldn't have thought possible a month ago." Tears filled Will's eyes. "It's her. It's Abby, I can't explain it, but ever since she came into our lives—" Dr. Patterson smiled gently. "I'm a scientist, Mr. Montgomery. I deal in measurable data and evidence-based medicine, but I've seen enough in my career to know that healing sometimes involves factors beyond our current understanding. Whatever the reason, Ethan is fighting harder than anyone expected. Let's focus on that and continue everything that's supporting this improvement." After the doctor left, Will returned to the kitchen to find Ethan and Abby deeply engaged in drawing pictures of what they imagined the moonflower would look like when it bloomed. "It'll be white and glow in the moonlight," Abby was explaining, "and it smells sweet like vanilla ice cream, but only at night. During the day, it sleeps all curled up." Will watched them, a new resolution forming in his mind. Whatever the future held, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Abby had become as essential to their family as the air they breathed. And he would do everything in his power to ensure she remained part of their lives, not just for Ethan's sake, but because somewhere along the way, this extraordinary child had begun to heal his own wounded heart as well. What had started as a simple act of kindness, allowing a lonely little girl to visit a sick boy, had grown into something profound and life-altering. And though Will didn't fully understand the mysterious connection between these two children, he recognized its power and value. That evening, after Abby had returned to Pine Hills and Ethan had fallen asleep with a peaceful smile on his face, Will made a decision. He called his lawyer and scheduled a meeting for the following morning. It was time to discuss what would be involved in adopting a little girl named Abby. Richard Holbrook, Will's longtime attorney, listened carefully as Will outlined his intentions regarding Abby. They sat in Will's home office, autumn sunlight streaming through the windows, while the lawyer took meticulous notes. "So, to be clear," Richard said, looking up from his legal pad, "you want to pursue legal guardianship of Abigail Foster, with the potential for adoption in the future?" "Yes," Will confirmed. "I need to understand the process, timeline, and any potential obstacles." Richard set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Will, I've been your lawyer for 15 years. I handled your mother's estate, your company's IPO, and Sarah's will. In all that time, I've never seen you make an impulsive decision." "This isn't impulsive," Will countered. "It's the most clear-headed decision I've made in years." "You've only known this child for a month," Richard pointed out gently. "And forgive me for being blunt, but your own son is still gravely ill. Are you sure this is the right time to take on the responsibility of another child?" Will stood and walked to the window. Outside, he could see Ethan in his wheelchair in the garden, bundled against the cool air, watching the gardeners plant fall bulbs. Even from a distance, Will could see how much stronger his son looked compared to just a few weeks ago. "Richard, I believe Abby is the reason Ethan is still alive. Dr. Patterson is using words like unprecedented improvement and potential remission. A month ago, we were discussing hospice care." Will turned to face his lawyer. "I know it sounds irrational, maybe even magical thinking, but that little girl brought something into our home that all the specialists and experimental treatments couldn't provide." Richard's expression softened. "Hope. More than hope," Will insisted. "A reason to fight. Connection, joy. Things I thought had disappeared from our lives forever when Sarah died and then Ethan got sick." He returned to his desk and sat down. "Besides, this isn't just about what Abby has done for us. It's about what we can do for her. She's been in the system for over a year. She lost her parents in that flash flood in western Massachusetts. She deserves a permanent home, a family who loves her. And you believe you and Ethan can be that family?" Will nodded firmly. "I know we can." Richard sighed and picked up his pen again. "All right. The process isn't simple, particularly for a single father with a critically ill child. The courts prioritize stable environments, and they'll have questions about your ability to care for two children, given Ethan's medical needs." "I have resources," Will reminded him. "I can hire whatever additional help is necessary. Money helps but isn't the only consideration. There will be home studies, interviews, background checks. Your high profile adds another layer of scrutiny." Richard made a few notes. "We should also learn more about Abby's specific situation. Are there any relatives who might have a claim? Any previous adoption attempts that fell through? These factors could affect our strategy." They spent the next hour outlining a plan. Richard would contact Pine Hills to initiate discussions and gather information about Abby's legal status. Meanwhile, Will would speak with Ms. Hartley about increasing Abby's visits and perhaps arranging overnight stays as a transition step. "One more thing," Richard said as he prepared to leave. "Have you discussed this with Ethan?" "Really discussed it beyond his initial suggestion?" Will smiled. "Not yet. I wanted to understand the process first, but I already know his answer. He adores Abby. He's the one who first suggested adopting her. Still, adding a sibling is a big adjustment, even under ideal circumstances. Make sure he understands what it would really mean." After Richard left, Will found Ethan in his room, carefully watering the moonflower seedling on his windowsill. The tiny plant had already grown visibly since Abby had brought it a week earlier. "Mrs. Eleanor told Abby that moonflowers grow fast," Ethan explained, setting down the small watering can. "She said we might see blooms within a month if we take good care of it." Will sat on the edge of the bed. "So you're doing a great job with it. Speaking of Abby, I'd like to talk to you about something important." Ethan looked up, instantly alert. "Is she okay? Did something happen?" "She's fine," Will reassured him quickly. I just wanted to talk more about what you suggested in the garden that day, about Abby becoming part of our family. Ethan's face brightened. Are we going to adopt her? For real? I'm looking into it, Will said cautiously. It's a complicated process and it might take some time. But before we go further, I need to make sure you understand what it would mean. Abby would be your sister. She would live here permanently. We would share our home, our time, our family with her. I know, Ethan said simply. That's why I asked you to do it. You'd have to share attention, share space. There might be times when you disagree or even argue, like all siblings do. Ethan considered this, then shrugged. Abby and I won't argue much. We like the same things, and she's already like family anyway. She just doesn't get to stay overnight yet. The uncomplicated certainty in his son's response touched Will deeply. Children had a way of cutting through complexities to see the essential truth of a situation. Well, I've spoken with Mr. Holbrook about starting the process. In the meantime, I thought perhaps we could invite Abby for an overnight visit this weekend. What do you think? Ethan's eyes widened with excitement. Yes, we could have a sleepover in the media room with popcorn and movies, and breakfast in the garden if it's not too cold. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Will found himself smiling. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, I need to speak with Miss Hartley at Pine Hills to make the arrangements. That conversation proved more challenging than Will anticipated. While Miss Hartley acknowledged the positive impact of Abby's visits to the Montgomery home, she expressed reservations about the sudden acceleration of their involvement. Mr. Montgomery, while I appreciate your interest in Abigail's welfare, I'm concerned about the pace at which this relationship is developing, she explained during their phone call. Overnight visits represent a significant escalation, and I'm not convinced it's in Abigail's best interests at this stage. May I ask why? Will kept his tone even, though he felt a flash of frustration. Abby and Ethan have formed a meaningful friendship. Both children benefit from their time together. I don't dispute that, Ms. Hartley replied, but Abigail has a history of forming intense attachments, followed by profound disappointment. Before coming to Pine Hills, she was placed briefly with a foster family, who ultimately decided they weren't prepared for a child with her. Unique emotional needs. This was new information. What do you mean by unique emotional needs? Ms. Hartley hesitated. Abigail is a special child. She's remarkably resilient given what she's endured, but she also exhibits unusual behaviors and beliefs. She's convinced she has certain abilities. The ability to know when people will recover from illness, for instance, or to sense when important changes are coming. Will felt a chill run down his spine, remembering Abby's absolute certainty that Ethan would recover when every medical indicator had suggested otherwise. Has she been evaluated by a psychologist? He asked carefully. Yes, several times. The consensus is that these beliefs represent a coping mechanism, a way for her to create a sense of control after experiencing such profound loss and helplessness during the flood. It's not uncommon for children who've experienced trauma. Miss Hartley paused. Mr. Montgomery, I have to be direct. Given your son's medical condition, I worry about what might happen to Abigail if... She didn't finish the sentence, but her implication was clear. What would happen to Abby if Ethan didn't survive? Dr. Patterson has documented significant improvements in Ethan's condition, Will said firmly. And regardless of what happens with my son's health, my commitment to Abby's well-being would remain absolute. If you're concerned about her forming an attachment that might end in disappointment, I can assure you that won't happen. I'm pursuing legal guardianship with the intention of eventual adoption. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. I see, Miss Hartley finally said. That's certainly a significant development. In that case, I think we should arrange a meeting with our social worker, Ms. Delgado, who manages Abigail's case. She would need to conduct an initial assessment before we could consider overnight visits, let alone more permanent arrangements. By the end of the call, Will had secured an appointment with Ms. Delgado for the following day, and the tentative approval for Abby's first overnight visit that weekend, contingent on the social worker's assessment. When he shared the news with Ethan, his son's excitement was tempered with a surprising insight. Dad, what if Abby doesn't want to live with us? What if she likes Pine Hills better? The question caught Will off guard. It hadn't occurred to him that Abby might not want to be part of their family. She always seems so happy to visit, so reluctant to leave. We'll need to ask her how she feels, Will acknowledged. This isn't something we would ever force on her. It has to be her choice too. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. I think she'll want to stay. She doesn't talk much about Pine Hills except for Mrs. Eleanor, but we should make sure she knows it's okay if she wants to think about it. Once again, Will was struck by his son's emotional intelligence and empathy. Despite his illness and all he'd endured, Ethan maintained a sensitivity to others' feelings that many adults never developed. The following afternoon, Will met with Carmen Delgado, a sharp-eyed social worker with 20 years of experience in the foster system. She arrived at the mansion with a comprehensive list of questions and an unimpressed demeanor that made it clear she wasn't intimidated by wealth or status. Mr. Montgomery, I appreciate your interest in Abigail, she began as they sat in the living room. But I need to understand your motivations. What makes you want to provide a home for a child you've known for such a short time? Will had anticipated this question. It began with how she's helped my son. Ethan was declining rapidly before Abby came into our lives. Since they've become friends, he's shown remarkable improvement, both physically and emotionally. Ms. Delgado nodded. So this is about gratitude. Repaying a debt? It started there, Will admitted. But it's evolved into something much deeper. I've come to care about Abby for who she is, her spirit, her resilience, her extraordinary capacity for joy despite everything she's been through. She deserves a permanent home, and we want to provide that for her. And if your son's condition worsens again, would your commitment to Abigail remain the same? Absolutely, Will stated without hesitation. My desire to give Abby a home isn't conditional on Ethan's health, though I believe with all my heart that he's going to recover. The social worker's expression softened slightly. Mr. Montgomery, I've worked with hundreds of families over the years. I've seen well-intentioned people rush into adoption or fostering without fully understanding the challenges involved. Abigail is a wonderful child, but she's also experienced significant trauma. She'll need patience, consistency, and professional support to process her past experiences. I understand that, and I'm prepared to provide whatever resources she needs. Ms. Delgado studied him for a moment. Resources aren't the only consideration. She'll need your time, your emotional availability. Running a major corporation while caring for a seriously ill child already places enormous demands on you. Adding another child to that equation. I've already begun restructuring my work responsibilities, Will interrupted. I've appointed a COO to handle day-to-day operations and reduced my direct involvement to strategic decisions. My priority is my family, both Ethan and, hopefully, Abby. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Ms. Delgado asking detailed questions about Will's parenting philosophy, his support systems, and how he envisioned integrating Abby into their lives. She also requested a tour of the home and asked to speak briefly with Ethan. By the end of her visit, she had agreed to recommend the overnight stay as a first step, though she made it clear that the path to guardianship or adoption would involve multiple assessments and a thorough review process. We'll need to observe how Abigail adjusts to spending extended time here, she explained, and we'll want to see how you handle the practical aspects of caring for both children simultaneously. As Will walked her to the door, Ms. Delgado offered one final insight. Mr. Montgomery, in my experience, children like Abigail, those who've experienced profound loss at an early age, often develop a heightened intuition, a sensitivity to the emotional currents around them. What some might interpret as special abilities is often an acute awareness of subtle cues that adults miss. Will nodded, thinking of Abby's confident pronouncement that Ethan would recover. Are you saying her beliefs are just a child's way of processing complex emotional information? Perhaps, Ms. Delgado replied, or perhaps there are forms of knowledge we don't fully understand. Either way, her convictions have clearly benefited your son, and that's what matters most. With the social worker's approval secured, Will called Pine Hills to confirm Abby's weekend visit. When he asked the staff to inform her of the arrangement, they suggested he might want to tell her himself during her regular Friday visit. She's been asking every day if there's news about staying overnight, the staff member explained. I think she'd be thrilled to hear it directly from you. Friday couldn't come quickly enough for Ethan, who insisted on helping prepare the guest room next to his for Abby's stay. Despite his still limited energy, He directed the staff in selecting colorful bedding, arranging stuffed animals on the pillows, and placing a vase of fresh flowers on the dresser. "Do you think she'll like it?" he asked anxiously, as Will helped him straighten a framed butterfly print on the wall. "I think she'll love it," Will assured him. "Remember, Abby's never concerned herself with material things. She cares about people, not possessions." Ethan nodded. "That's true. She never asks for anything, not even when we have dessert. I always have to offer to share with her." This observation gave Will pause. It was yet another insight into Abby's character, her reluctance to impose or ask for anything, despite her otherwise confident nature. It spoke of past disappointments, of learning early that wanting things could lead to heartache. When Abby arrived that afternoon, practically vibrating with excitement about the sleepover, Will found himself studying her with new eyes. Behind the bright smiles and boundless energy, he could now see the shadows, the careful watchfulness, the way she sometimes checked for reactions before fully committing to an action, the subtle signs of a child who had learned to navigate an unpredictable world. As she and Ethan sat together at the kitchen table, decorating cookies the chef had prepared for their afternoon snack, Will made a silent promise. If Abby became part of their family, he would do everything in his power to heal those invisible wounds, to create such consistency and security in her life that she would never again have to wonder if her presence was welcome or her needs would be met. And as he watched the two children laughing together, their heads bent over their colorful creations, he felt a sense of rightness settle over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, with Ethan's health, with the adoption process, with blending their lives together, he knew with absolute certainty that bringing Abby into their family was not just the right decision, but perhaps the most important one he would ever make. What had begun as an unexpected interruption at his gate had transformed into a journey of healing and connection that none of them could have anticipated. And for the first time since Sarah's passing and Ethan's diagnosis, Will found himself looking toward the future with something that felt remarkably like hope. The November evening was unusually mild for Boston, with a full moon rising over the city skyline. In Ethan's bedroom, the moonflower plant that had grown steadily over the past weeks was showing signs of imminent bloom. Their single bud had formed days earlier, and tonight it appeared ready to open. "It's happening tonight," Abby declared with certainty as she and Ethan sat by the window, watching the moonlight gradually illuminate the garden below. Mrs. Eleanor said moonflowers always bloom on full moon nights. Ethan leaned forward in his wheelchair, his face reflecting the silver moonlight. "How long will it take? Will we stay up all night to watch it?" "It happens slowly at first and then all at once," Abby explained, sounding like a miniature botanist. "Mrs. Eleanor says it's like magic. One minute it's a bud and the next time you look it's open and glowing." The past 3 weeks had established a new pattern in the Montgomery household. Abby now spent every weekend with them, arriving Friday afternoon and returning to Pine Hills Sunday evening. These visits had become the highlight of everyone's week, with each one smoother and more natural than the last. Tonight marked another milestone. Dr. Patterson had authorized a reduction in Ethan's medication following his latest tests, which showed continued improvement in his condition. Though he still required regular treatments and monitoring, the constant medical presence in the house had decreased significantly. The East Wing no longer resembled a hospital ward, but was returning to its original function as a family living space. "Dinner's ready whenever you two are," Will announced from the doorway. "Chef Marcus made that pasta Abby liked so much last weekend. The one with the little tomatoes and the green sauce," Abby asked, her eyes lighting up. Will smiled. "That's the one. Pesto with cherry tomatoes. Can we eat in here tonight, Dad?" Ethan requested. "We don't want to miss the moonflower blooming." "I suppose we could make an exception just for tonight," Will agreed, unable to resist the eager expressions on both children's faces. "I'll have Marcus set up a small table by the window." As he turned to leave, Abby called after him, "Mr. Montgomery, can you eat with us too? It'll be like a special celebration dinner." The simple request touched Will deeply. Abby had gradually become more comfortable asking for small things, a sign of her growing security in their relationship. "I'd be honored to join your moonflower watch party," he replied with a small bow that made both children giggle. Dinner was served on a round table positioned perfectly for moonflower observation, with the children taking turns checking the bud for signs of opening. Their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and elaborate stories, particularly from Abby, who had a natural gift for narrative. And then Sir Nutsworth the squirrel decided he would build the biggest acorn castle in the forest, she was explaining, using her fork to gesture dramatically. But he needed help, so he called all the other forest animals for a big meeting. Will watched her animation with amusement and growing affection. In these unguarded moments, Abby was simply a child enjoying herself, the weight of her past temporarily lifted from her small shoulders. And Ethan, responding to her energy, showed fewer signs of his illness with each passing day. His color had improved, his appetite had returned, and most remarkably, his latest blood tests showed the cancer cells were continuing to decrease. "Dad, when are you going to tell Abby the news?" Ethan asked suddenly, interrupting his own laughter at Abby's squirrel tale. Abby looked between them curiously. "What news?" Will set down his fork, giving Ethan a gentle look. "I was waiting for the right moment, buddy." "Now is the right moment," Ethan insisted. "While we're having our celebration dinner." Will took a deep breath. He had planned to have this conversation more formally, perhaps with Ms. Delgado present, but perhaps Ethan was right. This intimate moment of shared joy might be the perfect setting. "Abby, Ethan and I have been talking about something important," he began carefully. "We've really enjoyed having you visit us these past weeks." "I like visiting too," Abby replied, suddenly looking slightly wary, as if expecting the conversation to take a negative turn. Will noticed her shift in posture, the slight tensing of her shoulders, the way her hands dropped to her lap. These were the subtle signs Ms. Delgado had taught him to recognize, indicators of Abby's deep-seated fear of rejection or abandonment. "Actually, we were wondering how you might feel about visiting more permanently," Will continued gently, "about becoming part of our family." Abby blinked, her expression guarded. "What do you mean?" "He means we want to adopt you," Ethan explained eagerly. "So you'd live here all the time and be my sister." "For real?" Abby's eyes widened, darting between Ethan and Will as if checking for any sign of deception or joke. "You want to adopt me? To keep me?" The phrase "to keep me" pierced Will's heart. What a telling choice of words from a child who had experienced such profound loss. "Yes," Will confirmed softly. "I've been speaking with Miss Delgado and Pine Hills about becoming your legal guardian first, and then adopting you if that's something you would want." Abby sat very still, her small face a complex map of emotions, hope, disbelief, fear, longing. "But why?" she finally whispered. "Because we love you," Ethan answered simply, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "And you belong with us." Tears filled Abby's green eyes. "But what about when you get better? You might not need me anymore." The question revealed volumes about Abby's inner thoughts, her belief that her value lay in what she could provide rather than who she was. "Abby," Will said, moving his chair closer to hers, "this isn't about needing you, though we do. It's about wanting you in our lives because of who you are. Whether Ethan is sick or well, whether times are easy or difficult, you would be part of this family, always." A single tear slipped down Abby's cheek. "Really always? Even if I make mistakes or get in trouble sometimes?" "Especially then," Will assured her. "That's what family means. We stick together through everything." Abby looked down at her lap, her voice barely audible. "I've wanted a family again so much. I dream about it sometimes." "We want that too," Will said. "But this is your decision, Abby. There's no pressure. You can take time to think about it if you need to." Abby was quiet for a long moment, then raised her eyes to meet Will's. "I don't need to think about it. I want to stay. I want to be part of your family." Ethan let out a whoop of delight. "I told you, Dad. I told you she'd say yes." Abby giggled through her tears, a sound of pure joy that seemed to lighten the entire room. "Look," Ethan suddenly exclaimed, pointing to the windowsill. "The moonflower! It's opening." All three turned to watch as the tightly furled bud began to unfurl its petals in the moonlight, revealing a bloom of such perfect white that it seemed to glow with its own inner light. "It's beautiful," Abby breathed. "Just like Mrs. Eleanor said. And it smells like—" She leaned closer, inhaling deeply. "Like vanilla and something else. Something sweet." "It's perfect timing," Ethan declared. "The moonflower waited for our special night to bloom. Will smiled at the children's wonder, feeling a profound sense of rightness settle over him. The moonflower's bloom felt symbolic somehow, a visual representation of the new beginning they were embarking on together. "I think this calls for dessert," he announced. Chef Marcus made chocolate mousse. As they enjoyed their dessert, continuing to marvel at the moonflower's transformation, Will outlined the next steps in the adoption process. There would be more visits from Ms. Delgado, paperwork to complete, court appearances to schedule. It would take time, but the path forward was clear. "When will I get to bring my things from Pine Hills?" Abby asked, practical even in her excitement. "We can start bringing some of your belongings next weekend," Will explained. "And we'll need to think about decorating your room properly. The guest room is just temporary until we can create a space that really feels like yours." Abby's eyes widened. "I get to decorate my own room? Any way I want?" "Within reason," Will laughed. "But yes, we want it to be your special place." "I've never had my own room before," she confided. "At Pine Hills I share with 3 other girls. And before that—" She trailed off, shadows crossing her face at the memories of before the flood, before her world had changed forever. "Well, now you'll have your own room in your own home," Will assured her. "And we'll make it perfect." After dinner, as the evening grew late, the children insisted on maintaining their moonflower vigil, though both were clearly fighting sleep. Will arranged pillows and blankets on the window seat, creating a cozy nest where they could watch the blossom continue its miraculous transformation. "Just a little longer," Ethan pleaded, when Will suggested it might be time for bed. "The moonflower only blooms for one night. We can't miss it." "All right, half an hour more," Will conceded, settling into a nearby armchair with a book. Within 20 minutes, both children had drifted to sleep, Abby's dark head resting against Ethan's shoulder, their faces peaceful in the silvery moonlight that streamed through the window. The moonflower had fully opened now, its pristine white petals spread wide to receive the moon's glow, filling the room with a subtle, sweet fragrance. Will set aside his unread book and simply watch them sleep, these 2 remarkable children who had found each other against all odds. The scene before him held a poignant beauty that caught in his throat. Ethan, whose illness had once seemed an insurmountable darkness, now sleeping peacefully beside the little girl who had brought light back into their lives. With infinite care, Will lifted Abby first, carrying her to the guest room that would soon be transformed into her permanent bedroom. She stirred slightly as he tucked her in, murmuring something that sounded like "stay" before settling back into deep slumber. "I'm not going anywhere," Will whispered, brushing a strand of dark hair from her forehead. "I promise." Returning to Ethan's room, he found his son still asleep on the window seat, his face illuminated by the moonlight and the glowing white flower beside him. As Will gathered him into his arms, Ethan opened his eyes briefly. "Did you see, Dad?" he mumbled sleepily. "The moonflower bloomed just like Abby said it would." "Yes, buddy. It's beautiful." "Everything Abby says comes true," Ethan murmured as Will settled him into bed. "She said I would get better, and I am. She said we would be a family, and now we will be." Will tucked the blankets around his son, a curious mixture of emotions washing over him. He had always been a rational man, believing in science, evidence, measurable outcomes. Yet the events of the past 2 months had challenged his understanding of the world. How to explain Ethan's remarkable recovery, which had begun precisely when Abby entered their lives? How to account for the strange certainty with which she had predicted his improvement, when every medical expert had expected the opposite? As he turned off the bedside lamp, leaving only the moonlight filtering through the window, Will found himself accepting that perhaps there were forces at work in the universe that defied conventional explanation. Maybe Abby did possess some special intuition or awareness that others lacked. Or maybe, as Ms. Delgado had suggested, she simply recognized patterns and possibilities that adults constrained by logic and experience failed to see. Whatever the explanation, Will was profoundly grateful. In a few short months, his world had transformed from one of impending loss and grief to one of healing and hope. His son was recovering against all odds. Their home, once a silent mausoleum of fading memories, now echoed with laughter and stories. And soon, a remarkable little girl with old soul eyes would officially become part of their family, completing a circle that none of them had known was broken until she appeared at their gate. In the days that followed, the moonflower's bloom faded, as Mrs. Eleanor had warned it would. But even as its petals closed and fell away, new buds formed on the rapidly growing vine, promising future nights of blossoming beauty. It seemed a perfect metaphor for their lives now, cycles of growth and renewal, the promise of continued blooming even after periods of apparent dormancy. And at the center of this renewal was Abby, whose presence had somehow catalyzed a healing that transcended medical explanation. 2 weeks later, Dr. Patterson delivered the news they had been afraid to hope for. Ethan's latest comprehensive scans showed dramatic reduction in the cancer cells. His body was responding to the treatments in a way that the medical team could only describe as extraordinary. "I'm officially upgrading his prognosis from terminal to guarded," Dr. Patterson explained during a private consultation with Will. "And if this trend continues, we may be looking at the possibility of complete remission within 6 months. Will had to grip the edge of the desk to steady himself. "How is this possible? You were preparing us for hospice care just 3 months ago." Dr. Patterson shook his head slightly, a mixture of professional caution and genuine wonder in his expression. "Medically speaking, I can point to several factors: the aggressive treatment protocol, Ethan's young age, the additional supportive therapies we introduced. But in my 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen such a dramatic turnaround in a case this severe." He hesitated, then added more softly, "Off the record, Mr. Montgomery. Sometimes we witness recoveries that science can't fully explain. Call it the human spirit. Call it the power of connection. Call it whatever you will, but there's something happening with your son that goes beyond our medical understanding." Will thought of Abby's absolute certainty from that very first day. "You're not going to leave. You still have way too many things to do." Had she somehow known what even the most experienced specialists couldn't predict? Or had her belief itself been a catalyst for Ethan's healing? He might never know the answer with certainty. But as he left the doctor's office to share the wonderful news with the children, Will found that the explanation mattered less than the reality before him. His son was returning to health. Their family was growing, and the future that had once seemed unbearably bleak now shimmered with possibility. That evening, as they celebrated Dr. Patterson's update with a special dinner in the garden room, Abby made an observation that captured the transformation they had all experienced. "See, Ethan," she said, helping herself to a second serving of mashed potatoes. "I told you that you had too many important things to do, like being my brother and showing me how to use that telescope on the roof and learning to play chess properly." Ethan grinned. "And going to the butterfly garden and exploring the sealed wine cellar and all the other things on our list." "Exactly," Abby nodded sagely. Way too many adventures to miss out on. Will watched them chattering excitedly about future plans, trips they would take, books they would read together, the treehouse they wanted to build in the garden next spring. Their conversation assumed a future that stretched endlessly before them, filled with discovery and joy. And for the first time since Sarah's passing and Ethan's diagnosis, Will allowed himself to imagine that same expansive future, a life where loss and grief were not erased, but were balanced by new connections, new joy, new love. A life where the three of them moved forward together, supporting each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Will stood alone in the garden, looking up at the full November moon. In Ethan's window, he could see the silhouette of the moonflower vine, its newest bloom opening to the silvery light. From the soon-to-be Abby's room next door, a small nightlight glowed steadily, a beacon of the permanent place she would occupy in their home and hearts. "Thank you," he whispered to the night sky, not entirely sure who or what he was addressing. The universe, fate, the mysterious workings of chance that had brought a remarkable little girl to their gate exactly when they needed her most. The adoption hearing was scheduled for January, just after the new year. Until then, they would continue building their life together, day by day, creating the foundation for the family they were becoming, not defined by blood, but by something equally powerful, the choice to belong to each other, to heal together, to face whatever came next as one united whole. And as the gentle night breeze carried the sweet scent of the moonflower through the garden, Will felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. Whatever magic or miracle had brought them to this point, He was grateful beyond words for the second chance they had all been given, the chance to bloom again, like the moonflower, even after the darkest night. 5 years later. The early June morning was perfect, clear blue sky, gentle breeze, and the Montgomery garden in full, glorious bloom. Cherry trees lined the stone pathway, their petals occasionally drifting down like pink snow. Roses climbed the trellises, their fragrance mingling with the scent of freshly cut grass. Near the central fountain, chairs had been arranged in a semicircle, facing an archway entwined with flowers. Will stood at the kitchen window, watching the catering staff make final preparations for the day's celebration. 5 years had passed since that autumn day, when a determined little girl in tattered clothes had appeared at their gate, changing their lives forever. "Dad, have you seen my blue tie? The one with the little silver stars?" Ethan's voice called from upstairs. "Check your dresser, top drawer on the right," Will replied, smiling to himself. At 12 years old, Ethan had grown tall and strong, with no physical signs of the illness that had once threatened his life. His final cancer treatment had been 3 years ago, and every checkup since had confirmed the same miraculous result: complete remission, with no indications of recurrence. Dr. Patterson, who still monitored Ethan annually more out of attachment than medical necessity, had described his recovery as one for the medical textbooks. The case study he had published in a prestigious oncology journal carefully documented the unprecedented turnaround, though it could offer no definitive explanation for why a child given weeks to live had not only survived but thrived. Will had his own theories, of course. They all did. But some things defied logical explanation, and they had learned to accept the mystery of it with gratitude rather than questions. "Morning, Mr. M," called a cheerful voice as Abby bounded into the kitchen, already dressed in a flowing emerald dress that matched her eyes perfectly. At 12, she had blossomed into a spirited preteen, her dark hair now falling in waves to her shoulders, her face losing its childish roundness, but retaining the old soul quality that had always made her seem wise beyond her years. "You look beautiful, Abby," Will said warmly. "All ready for the big day?" She twirled, making the skirt of her dress flare out. "Almost. Mrs. Eleanor is helping me with my hair when she arrives. She says she's going to weave flowers into my braids." Mrs. Eleanor, the elderly resident from Pine Hills, who had first told Abby about moonflowers, had become a beloved extended family member over the years. After Pine Hills closed due to funding issues, Will had helped relocate her to a comfortable senior living community nearby and made sure she remained part of their lives. "The garden looks amazing," Abby continued, peering out the window. "The roses are perfect, just like Mom would have wanted." The casual way she referred to Sarah as Mom still touched Will deeply. Though Abby had never met Sarah, she had embraced her memory through photographs, stories, and the traditions they maintained. In turn, Will and Ethan had honored the memory of Abby's birth parents, creating a family narrative that acknowledged all their roots while celebrating the bonds they had formed. 5 years, Will murmured, putting an arm around Abby's shoulders. "Can you believe it?" Abby leaned against him, comfortable in the affection they shared. "Sometimes it feels like I've always been here. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I saw the castle for the first time." "You still call it the castle," Will chuckled. "Because that's what it is," she insisted with a grin. "A magic castle where wishes come true." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jessica, Will's longtime assistant, carrying an armful of garment bags. "The tuxedos are back from the final alterations," she announced, hanging them on a hook by the door. "And the photographer will be here in an hour for family photos before the guests arrive." Will nodded his thanks. "Everything else on schedule?" "Absolutely," Jessica assured him. "The caterers are set up. The musicians are doing a sound check in the garden, and the cake will arrive at 11. Oh, and Richard called to say he's running 15 minutes late, but will definitely be here for the ceremony." Richard Holbrook, Will's attorney who had handled Abby's adoption 5 years earlier, remained a close family friend and was among the select group invited to today's intimate celebration. "Perfect. Thanks for coordinating everything, Jessica." As Jessica departed with her ever-present clipboard, Ethan appeared in the kitchen, attempting to knot his tie with limited success. "Dad, I can't get this right," he complained, the blue silk dangling unevenly from his collar. Will stepped over to help him, reflecting on how much his son had grown. Ethan now stood nearly at his shoulder, lanky and beginning to show hints of the young man he would become. The years of illness seemed like a distant nightmare, replaced by the robust reality of a boy who played soccer, excelled in science competitions, and bickered good-naturedly with his sister. "Nervous?" Will asked quietly as he adjusted the tie. Ethan shook his head. "Not really. Just want everything to be perfect, you know." "For Mom." Will smiled at his son's earnest expression. "It will be perfect, because we're all together." That's what would matter most to her. A knock at the front door signaled the arrival of the first guests. The day they had been planning for months was finally here. The 5th anniversary of Abby's adoption and the renewal of family vows they had decided to hold in Sarah's beloved. The ceremony had been Abby's idea, conceived during a conversation about family traditions and milestones. "We should do something special for our 5-year family anniversary," she had suggested over dinner one winter evening. "Something that celebrates all of us, including Mom Sarah." Will had been deeply moved by the suggestion, and together they had planned this day. Not a traditional renewal of vows between spouses, but a renewal of commitment between family members, honoring both those present and those remembered. The morning passed in a flurry of activity: photographs in the garden, greeting arriving guests, last-minute adjustments to flowers and seating. By noon, everything was ready. Approximately 50 people had gathered in the garden. Close friends, colleagues who had become like family, teachers who had supported both children through their academic journeys, medical staff who had been part of Ethan's care team, and a few special residents and staff from the former Pine Hills Children's Home. Mrs. Eleanor sat in the front row, her white hair adorned with a crown of small roses that matched the ones in Abby's braids. Now 97, she remained sharp and spirited, often reminding everyone that she still intended to reach 100 just to prove those doctors extra wrong. As the string quartet began to play, Will took his place beneath the flower-covered archway, Ethan and Abby on either side of him. A photograph of Sarah rested on a small table nearby, surrounded by candles and her favorite white roses. "Friends and family," Will began, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed garden, "thank you for joining us on this special day. 5 years ago, our family was reborn when Abby officially became a Montgomery. Today we gather to renew our commitment to each other and to honor all the love that has brought us to this moment, including the love of those no longer with us." He turned first to Ethan. "Ethan, when you were born, I promised to be the best father I could be, to support you through every challenge, to celebrate every joy. That promise has been tested in ways I never could have imagined, but it has never wavered. Today I renew that vow to you as you continue growing into the remarkable young man your mother always knew you would become." Ethan, usually so casual and teenaged cool, blinked rapidly against unexpected tears. "Thanks, Dad," he managed, his voice catching slightly. Will then turned to Abby, whose green eyes were already shimmering with emotion. "Abby, 5 years ago you marched into our lives with absolute certainty that you belonged here. You were right. You brought light back into our home when we needed it most. You taught us about courage, about faith, about the extraordinary power of believing in possibilities that others can't see. Today, I renew my promise to be your father in every way that matters, to cherish your unique spirit, and to support you in becoming whoever you choose to be." Abby smiled through her tears, reaching to squeeze his hand tightly. "And to Sarah," Will continued, looking toward her photograph, "I renew my promise to honor your memory by loving our children with all my heart, by keeping your spirit alive in this home, and by embracing the joy you always found in life, even when it seems difficult." He turned back to the gathered guests. Now Ethan and Abby have prepared their own vows to each other. Ethan stepped forward first, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "Abby, when I was really sick, you told me I wasn't going to leave because I had too many important things to do. You were the only one who believed that, including me. But you were right." He paused, gathering himself. "I promise to always be your brother, to remember that day you showed up at our gate, and to never forget that sometimes the best things in life arrive in unexpected ways. I promise to argue with you sometimes, because that's what siblings do, but to always have your back when it matters." The guests chuckled softly at his honest acknowledgement of sibling dynamics. And most importantly, Ethan continued, I promise to keep believing in possibilities, just like you taught me. To remember that doctors don't always know everything. That magic exists if you know where to look for it, and that family can be created in many different ways. Abby wiped away a tear before stepping forward with her own notes. Ethan, when I first saw this castle from the park, I had no idea I was looking at my future home. I just knew I needed to find out who lived here. She smiled at the memory. I promise to be your sister always, to keep collecting rocks that look like faces, to help you with math homework even when you're grumpy about it, and to remember that day in the garden when you gave me a rose from your mum's garden and made me feel like I truly belonged somewhere for the first time since the flood. She turned to include Will in her gaze. And to both of you, I promise to keep our family stories alive, all of them, the sad ones and the happy ones. I promise to help us remember Mom Sarah's smile and her love of gardens. I promise to honor my birth parents by living fully and joyfully, the way they would have wanted. And I promise to keep believing in magic, in healing, and in the power of finding exactly where you belong. There wasn't a dry eye in the garden as Abby finished speaking. Will gathered both children close in a tight embrace, the three of them standing together beneath the arch of flowers, united by bonds that transcended biology or circumstance. As the ceremony concluded and the celebration transitioned to a garden luncheon, guests mingled among the flowers, sharing stories and memories. Will found himself beside Dr. Patterson near the rose garden. It's remarkable, the doctor commented, watching Ethan race across the lawn with several friends, his movements strong and sure. If you had told me 5 years ago that we would be here today celebrating like this. Will nodded, understanding all that remained unspoken. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night and go check on him, just to make sure it's all real. I've documented many cases throughout my career, Mr. Montgomery, but your son's recovery remains the most extraordinary. In medical terms, we call it a spontaneous remission when we can't fully explain a recovery. But between us, the doctor's gaze shifted to where Abby stood nearby, helping Mrs. Eleanor select desserts from the buffet table. I think there are healing forces at work in this world that science hasn't yet found a way to measure. Will followed his gaze, watching as Abby filled a plate with Mrs. Eleanor's favorite treats. Her head bent attentively to catch the older woman's soft words. She knew, he said quietly. From that very first day, she knew Ethan would recover when every medical indicator suggested otherwise. Children sometimes see possibilities that adults miss, Dr. Patterson replied diplomatically. Or perhaps he trailed off, leaving the alternative unexplored. Perhaps some people do have gifts we can't explain, Will finished for him. Over the years, he had come to accept that Abby possessed an intuition that defied conventional understanding. She seemed to know things before they happened, not in a dramatic, supernatural way, but in a quiet, matter-of-fact manner that was all the more compelling for its simplicity. She had known Ethan would recover. She had predicted when the adoption would be finalized, down to the exact date. She had sensed Mrs. Eleanor's minor heart attack before the woman herself had recognized the symptoms, potentially saving her life by insisting that Will check on her one Sunday morning. Yet Abby herself never claimed any special abilities. When asked about these instances, she simply shrugged and said, I just know some things. It's like hearing a whisper that other people can't hear. The afternoon unfolded in a tapestry of joyful moments. Ethan and his friends organizing an impromptu soccer game on the lawn. Abby and Mrs. Eleanor teaching younger children how to make flower crowns. Will sharing quiet conversations with friends who had supported them through the darkest times. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting golden light across the garden, Will called for attention one final time. Before we conclude our celebration, there's one more tradition we'd like to observe, he announced, beckoning Ethan and Abby to join him. 5 years ago, on the day Abby legally became part of our family, we planted a tree together in this garden, a symbol of our growing connections and shared future. He gestured toward a young oak that now stood nearly 15 feet tall at the garden's edge, its branches spreading wide. Today we're going to plant something new beside it. Gardeners brought forward a small but sturdy moonflower plant, its vine already beginning to twine around a decorative trellis. The moonflower from my windowsill, Ethan exclaimed, recognizing the descendant of the original plant Abby had brought years earlier. The very same, Will confirmed. We've been growing this cutting in the greenhouse, waiting for today." Together, the three of them knelt around the prepared soil. Each took a turn with the trowel, digging the hole and carefully placing the plant. As they patted the soil around its base, Abby spoke softly. "Mrs. Eleanor says moonflowers remind us that some of the most beautiful things bloom in darkness, when you least expect them, and that every bloom, no matter how brief, is worth waiting for." Will rested his hands on his children's shoulders, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 years earlier, he had been a broken man watching his only son slip away, unable to imagine any future beyond grief. Now he stood in a sunlit garden, surrounded by friends and family, with 2 healthy, thriving children who filled his days with purpose and joy. The contrast was not lost on him, nor was the profound gift he had been given when a determined little girl with old soul eyes decided his mansion looked like a castle and needed to be explored. Later, as the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Will found himself alone with Mrs. Eleanor for a moment, near the newly planted moonflower. "She's special, you know," the elderly woman said, nodding toward Abby, who was across the garden helping collect gift bags for departing guests. "Always has been from the moment she arrived at Pine Hills." "Yes, she is," Will agreed. Mrs. Eleanor's weathered hand gently touched a moonflower leaf. "When I first told her about these flowers, she listened with such attention. Most children her age wouldn't have cared about some old woman's plant stories, but Abby she understood immediately, about patience, about faith in things unseen. She kept asking questions until I told her where to find seedlings." Will hadn't heard this part of the story before, so that's how she knew to bring one for Ethan. Mrs. Eleanor nodded. "The very next day after meeting him, she came to me and said, 'Mrs. Eleanor, I need a moonflower plant for my friend in the castle. He's sick, but he's going to get better, and I want him to see something beautiful while he waits.'" She was so certain, so determined. "She's always been sure about the things that matter most," Will said softly. "That kind of certainty is rare," Mrs. Eleanor replied, her eyes twinkling with wisdom, earned across nearly a century of life. "Some might call it a gift, others might call it faith. I simply call it seeing with the heart instead of the eyes." As the sun set over the garden, casting long shadows across the lawn, the family gathered one last time beneath the flower arch for a final photograph. Will stood tall in the center, an arm around each child. Ethan, on the verge of adolescence, tried to maintain a cool demeanor, but couldn't suppress his genuine smile. Abby, ever expressive, beamed with unrestrained joy, her flower-woven braids catching the golden evening light. 1, 2, 3, perfect, called the photographer, capturing the moment. And it was perfect, Will thought, not in the flawless, immaculate sense, but in the authentic, deeply human way that acknowledged both the heartbreak and the healing that had shaped their journey. Perfect in its wholeness, its completeness, its full-circle quality. As they walked back to the house together in the gathering twilight, Abby slipped her hand into Will's, a gesture she had maintained even as she grew older. "Happy family-versary." "Dad," she said softly, "happy family-versary." "Abby," he replied, squeezing her hand gently. Above them, the evening's first star appeared in the darkening sky. In a few hours the moon would rise, and somewhere in the garden, a moonflower would open its pristine petals to the silver light, its brief but exquisite bloom a reminder of life's most precious truth, that love, in all its forms, remains the most powerful healing force in the universe. As they reached the house, warm light spilling from its windows across the terrace, Will paused for a moment to look back at the garden,